Welcome to Backroom Talk. Todd's an OPEX OG, right? Like he owns South Loop Strength Conditioning, which is they just have such a great reputation.
I was not someone who, at any point up until becoming involved in the fitness industry, would I have thought that I would be involved in the fitness industry. I grew up playing music a lot, played in punk bands and stuff like that in high school, and toured in bands for a while.
Did read your article, the op-ed that came out in Morning Chalk Up on why my gym isn't an essential service. Did you get any blowback from that?
Definitely got some blowback.
To listen to more Backroom Talk, be sure to subscribe. Learn to design personalized programs with the OPEX system of coaching by heading to opexfit.com. Tell us a little bit about yourself, man. I know you dabble in fitness a little bit, but who cares about that right now? You do a lot of other very, very interesting things, man.
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably the thing that I spend a lot of time doing that I suppose is interesting for a fitness person is I'm involved in a lot of heavy metal stuff, right? I play in 2 death metal bands. Actually, I'm wearing a shirt from my gym right now that's ripped off from a Norwegian black metal band's logo. And yeah, I mean, I think that I grew up playing music a lot, right? I mean, I played in punk bands and stuff like that in high school, and toured in bands for a while after, during college and graduating from college. And for a little bit, I thought that I might even actually want to do that as my life. But after being on a few tours that were a little bit too grueling and sort of seeing too much of the inside of the music industry, I was like, you know what, this isn't really what I'm interested in doing. I'm frustrated because I can't work out and we're just eating garbage food at gas stations all the time. And so then, accidentally ended up working in the fitness industry full time and accidentally opened a gym. And so, I've still tried to prioritize as much as possible, continuing to work on music. I started taking guitar lessons and really trying to force actual practicing into my schedule since I was a self-taught musician growing up, which at the time I thought was cool, but as an actual adult engaged in, teaching people how to do things is really stupid because you just learn a lot of bad ideas and, have to figure things out for yourself that people figured out how to do long ago. So, I think that that's something that's a big part of what I do and something that's a priority for me that, is easy to get shoved aside through the rigors of small business ownership and having a lot of emails all the time. But, you make it happen anyway.
What do you mean by the band road life? What did that look like, man? What, outside of eating garbage food and not being able to work out, what did you like or not like about that?
It's interesting, right? Because a lot of people think that going on tour is a sort of glamorous, fun lifestyle with a lot of adventure and they've maybe seen a Motley Crue movie or have some idea of what things are like. And honestly, it's really kind of grueling and boring. And I think anyone who has ever traveled for work has probably experienced something somewhat similar where you're just kind of going from place to place and you're in a lot of different areas, but your existence is sort of the same in every area where you're okay, I can just use the example of being on tour with a band where you're great, we have to be in this new city that's 6 hours away. So we have to get up relatively early and drive there. And then we have to load into the venue at this specific time. And then we have to sound check at this specific time. And the show is at this specific time. So you have these chunks of your schedule where you have to be somewhere. And in between those times is not long enough to really do anything other than just go to a nearby Starbucks because they have Wi-Fi and, people in the band want to do the same thing that they've done every day and not go somewhere interesting. And you're just cool. So we basically just sort of exist in this haze of unloading and loading equipment and trying to get on the Wi-Fi at Starbucks. So it's not as fun as people might think, although there are obviously high points, where you have a show that's particularly good, or some friends in a city that, you don't see necessarily that often, or you do actually have a little bit more time somewhere and you're able to, spend a lot of time walking around some, winding streets in Eastern Europe or whatever. And so there's definite moments that are very, very, fulfilling and exciting, but a lot of it is very much just a grind, and it's difficult to kind of do much other than exist in this kind of pre-scheduled haze of not really being able to get anything done. So
you were in a legit, you're traveling overseas I don't know what legit versus not means when it comes to bands, but when I think of like people that I know that have messed around with being in a band, they're playing like at a local, dump bar or something like that. So you were like actually traveling around and doing this thing and making money?
Well, so that's one of the other things, right? It's really difficult for really anyone to make a lot of money doing anything in music, right? And that even bands that actually, given that this is backroom talk, a lot of folks own fitness businesses, and it's like, I can take in a lot of revenue, but if I have a landlord and any employees, I don't really get to keep any of it. This isn't working out so well, right? That bands operate in a very similar dynamic where even bands, I know a lot of people who are very quote unquote successful in the music industry, but essentially, by the time they pay for the bus, their booking agent gets a cut of everything. Maybe they have some people who they have to hire for their crew, et cetera. By the time that the money is left over for the band, there's really not a whole lot. So there's plenty of people who are very successful in the music industry from an outside perspective. That, are on tour 9 months out of the year and live with their parents and drive Uber the times that they're home, because that they personally don't take home very much money. And, it's just not a very long-term sustainable lifestyle for a lot of folks. There's people too, again, in the sort of back end of the industry who one would think are super successful. And they're like, you know what? I'm just going to become like a drum tech for a really, really famous band because I don't want to deal with the nonsense of trying to figure out how to make this like a life that actually makes sense for me.
Where does fitness come in, man? Like you say there's like connections or synergies with coaches and gym owners, paying a landlord and blah, blah, blah. And, they come out not making as much money. Why go from, not being fulfilled or wanting to continue with the band life into fitness? Where did that kind of come in?
Yeah, that's something that was, like I said, it was very much an accident. I was not someone who at any point up until becoming involved in the fitness industry, would I have thought that I would be involved in the fitness industry, right? And I don't think that too many people around me would have thought that I would have been involved in the fitness industry. I definitely, had an interest in soccer growing up. I played a lot, and then actually had the sort of existential crisis of being like, oh, am I a soccer person or am I like a punk person in high school, right? And it sort of definitely went more in the punk road rather than being, yelled at by some maniac on the soccer pitch. I was like, I think I'd rather just go to band practice. This is not so much what I'm into. I gravitated towards difficult training and, just wanting to do hard things, and ended up finding CrossFit through that process, right? You spend enough time on the internet looking for difficult workouts, and you come across CrossFit and you're like, oh yeah, I think I've heard of this. This is supposed to be hard, and you start doing it, right? And so I was doing CrossFit just really on my own, kind of like a lot of people in the 2008 to 2010 era, just sort of like looking up the workouts, going to Bally Fitness at the time, and just doing the stupidest stuff possible, I imagine. I have some videos of myself training from a few years later that are just awful. And so I can't even imagine what would have been happening in the Globo gym, right? Where you're just like, man, this is really embarrassing. And I was probably judged relentlessly by the various like water jug toting tank top bros, as I should have been. It was something that I just became very interested in and found a lot of fulfillment in terms of like, okay, like how does this actually work? How does one snatch? Like, how do you get better at this? And through that process of just sort of self-educating and trying to figure out what was going on, I ended up learning enough that I was able to help other people. So I started coaching based upon that, which again, wasn't really something I had any intention of doing, but the idea of like, okay, I can actually coach people and make enough money to exist doing that was pretty appealing. And so I just kind of accidentally started doing that. And again, like a lot of other people in that time, you very quickly are sort of like, okay, if I want to make this an actual career, or like have something that makes any sense, maybe I should open my own gym. And so, sort of did that again, recklessly and without any real idea of what was going on. And have stumbled forth and continue to have enough of a gym exist to be here today, I suppose.
How much overlap was there with touring with the band and then finding fitness and beginning your coaching journey?
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely interested in fitness before like a lot of touring stuff because, like I said, I was doing a lot of hard workouts and not necessarily CrossFit, but I remember there was some quote unquote Navy SEAL workout, right? You're like, yeah, like what do the Navy SEALs do to work out that I would do that was, some people would probably recognize this. It was something like you would run a few miles. It was like a pseudo Murph type of situation, right? It was like you would run a few miles and you would do some very high volume number of dips. It was like you do 100 dips, maybe 200 push-ups and 100 pull-ups or something like that, right? And then you would run a few miles again. And it was not necessarily done with the like intensity or the sort of like mindset of a CrossFit athlete doing a workout. But, I would do that a few times a week, which is just absurd thinking about it, right? Where you're like, why would I, like, what in the world was I doing? Just the same workout over and over and over again. But it was just, what you did when you didn't know what you were doing. And so I was doing things like that, and I was trying to do it on tour. I would go on runs and do push-ups and things like that. And I did start to actually do CrossFit workouts while I was still touring somewhat regularly. And yeah, I mean, I would try to get people to do them with me. I actually do remember I was on Warped Tour in 2010 and was trying to do CrossFit stuff, right? And I had like my luggage and I would do, like overhead walking lunges with my luggage. And one of the guys from a band called the Casualties had some dumbbells and he would sort of do like a standard like fluff and buff type of workout. I remember trying to do some training with him and we were trying to do handstand push-ups kicked up against the side of their trailer. And so I was definitely like trying to get training in while on tour. But it was obviously challenging, but I think that part of it, especially at that time, was just being like, okay, we're just going to be adaptable and figure out how to make it happen.
I just have to take a moment to reflect that you just said you were on Warped Tour. So as like a 14-year-old girl, that was my dream. And I grew up in Australia, so we didn't have access to tours like you guys do in Australia. Oh, sorry, in America. But
sure.
Yeah, that was my teenage dream, was going on Warped Tour.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, Warped Tour as an artist is absolutely brutal. The routing on it, well, RIP, right? Warped Tour, I think was last year the last year of it.
I don't know. I'm not keeping tabs anymore.
I think last year was the final Warped Tour, right? That sort of like traveling festival model. I think that they realized that doesn't really make any sense. But the routing on it was absolutely insane. That because they would want to hit major markets on weekends, so it would be like, okay, but when the year that I was on it, I did like a West Coast run of it, so it'd be like you'd want to play whatever. LA on one weekend and San Francisco on another weekend, and everything on the West Coast is kind of far apart. So you just like do these insane drives constantly. I think that the first night that I played was in Kansas, and then I think the next night after that was potentially supposed to be in Calgary and ended up being in Edmonton, which is like a 36-hour drive, right? So it's like you literally play, sleep for 3 hours at the venue, and then have to drive actually nonstop, just like rotating drivers to get to the next venue. So Warped Tour was a very grueling endeavor.
Like, sorry, the math didn't make sense. You said next day driving.
Yeah. So they would take a day off, right? So it'd be like the next show would be right 36 hours away. So you basically just have to drive like pretty much straight from the end of the one show to the beginning of the next one.
I'm sure there's got to be like a lot of debauchery going on to get you through traveling like that. Is there, you're in the fitness world now, life looks different, but is there anything about that lifestyle that you miss?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the amount of debauchery is it's interesting, right? Again, it's not really what people think, right? People think it's like, oh, it's just this like crazy party all the time, and there certainly are moments like that, like it happens. But I think a lot of it, as someone who's sort of seen the inside of it, I think a lot of the drug and alcohol abuse is people sort of self-medicating out of boredom, right? You're just like I said before, you're in this weird schedule that kind of doesn't make sense and isn't very conducive. Your sleep is super altered all the time. And you're like, great, I have this weird 4-hour time block with a few things thrown in where I can't do anything. I might as well just get high. So I think that there's certainly an element of just, like how do I stimulate myself to exist that results in some of that debauchery. Some of it too is if you're in a new spot with friends and you just sort of start egging each other on, like it's very easy for, people to decide like, oh, great, like we're going to try to whatever, like break into this pool that we see somewhere. And, you just kind of like decide to do stupid things like that groups of traveling young men tend to do. But in terms of the actual lifestyle, I think that, I'm still in bands that will go and do stuff, and it's a nice thing to do for whatever, a weekend or a few days at a time. I mean, obviously in the COVID era, it's big question mark as to when any of those kinds of activities will return. But it's something that you can scratch the itch on occasion rather than being like, great, I want to be on tour several months out of the year. Like, no real interest in doing that.
So what's going on with your gym at the moment in light of COVID?
Yeah, totally. We're in downtown Chicago, so I can give just sort of a framework for what the regulations look like, what the rules look like, and how we're kind of adapting to that. So for framework, what is today? It's the end of August, right? And in Chicago currently, the overall cases have kind of like just sort of been steady at something around 300-ish per day for like a rolling 7-day average. And the city is using 200 cases per day as like a benchmark that they want to be below, and 400 cases per day as a benchmark above which like further regulations will sort of come down the pipeline. So it's just sort of in this in-between spot where, things are open, but with a lot of restrictions, and people are, for the most part, being pretty good about like mask wearing and generally following guidelines. But it's just sort of this like limbo spot that's not really clearly bad or clearly good in terms of overall trajectory. So that's just kind of like the general environment. For fitness businesses, right now we can have, the regulation is essentially group classes of up to 10 people at once, social distancing requirements. And I don't know if there's any other like top-down regulations that matter a lot, but for us, we do, a combination of group classes and personal training and program design. So we have sort of like 3 different populations that are all kind of coming in, and we basically just taped off the floor like a lot of people have been doing into lanes that are 6 feet apart, and had to enforce a bunch of pretty strict sign-up procedures of like, hey, if you're coming in to do your program, like you have to sign up for a time and you have to leave when it's done. If you're coming in to do a group class, you have to sign up. You can't show up if you didn't actually get a spot on an actual spot on the floor, right? And personal training, like coaches, make sure that, you're not going over the total number of people allowed at once when you're actually booking clients. And we're a bit lucky in that we have like 2 spaces that we can sort of train in. So we're able to, we've essentially said we're going to keep, 10 people on the main floor training at once. And we have like a side room that we're having 4 people at once in. So we're sort of capping our overall attendance at 14. And it's just a matter of like, can we get people to follow the regulations and be respectful, which for the most part, I think people are. Although we're starting to see that break down a little bit as we've added more people coming back in, right? That initially it was kind of a slow trickle. And we're starting to hit the point of like new members are signing up, old members are coming back. And now we're sort of like, great, this is a good problem to have, but we have way more people who want to train than can actually fit in the gym at a time. So how are we going to figure that out? And how are we going to make the, like I said before, the business model make sense where, okay, we're, at 50% of our total people at once that we're allowed to be in the gym at once. How does this work going forward? Which, I don't know if I have the answer to that. So
does that have anything to do with your square footage, or are they just like the city of Chicago is like 10 people? Like if you have 500 square feet or 10,000?
Originally, the guideline was, I believe it was 25% of capacity, which I don't know what that actually meant. If it was like fire code capacity, which is how I read it, that wouldn't really restrict anyone for anything, right? Like the fire code capacity for our gym was like 200 something people, I think, right? Because we have over 7,500 square feet. So, we couldn't even fit that many people in there. And the only time we would have that many people in is like hosting a competition or something. But in Chicago, the rule is straight up group classes are capped at 10 individuals. I'm not exactly sure how the regulations work for larger gyms that are potentially doing, a lot of people training on their own or personal training. I think that it may still be that 25% capacity for them, but that might be more relevant for a larger like big box gym. I'm not actually totally sure how that works.
How long were you guys closed before you were able to reopen with these guidelines?
Yeah, so we closed the gym in the middle of March. And I think we closed maybe a week or two before gyms were mandated to close. Because we decided to close when it was mandated that bars and restaurants close. Right. Because we were sort of talking internally and we decided, you know what, as soon as we realized that like we're going to be closed no matter what, we should just close. It's not worth it to continue staying open just based upon, what the trajectory was looking like. And it became pretty obvious that, okay, even if it's not mandated that gyms are going to be closed, it will be within the next 10 days. So like just pull the plug now. So we closed beginning/middle of March and we were allowed to reopen in some capacity, I think in the middle of June. And Chicago has sort of like changed the regulations a few times and I don't remember all the exact details of how that worked, but we were originally allowed to open, not doing classes and essentially doing like one-on-one training. So we did that for a little bit and then we were allowed to do some form of classes and then we were allowed to have more people in the gym with a little bit less regulation and then they reduced the total capacity. Although what we were doing before was pretty close to what we are doing now, right? I think we maybe had a few more slots available for people to take, and we weren't as strict about the 10 people max on the main training floor at once. But we were trying to think about, okay, what's our responsibility as far as not being another vector for COVID to potentially spread, or just like setting a bad example for other gyms. And so we were being pretty strict with like, we don't want to have 25 people in here at once. If you just look at the math of what is the prevalence of COVID in the population of Chicago, and you have 45 people all in the same spot, what's the likelihood that one of those people is going to be potentially spreading COVID? It's like the numbers on that don't look good. And there's some interesting fluctuations in the actual mathematics of it, where it's like, depending on the prevalence in the population, like 15-ish people tends to be where there's like a critical point where all of a sudden the risk starts to go way, way, way up. So we sort of use that as a benchmark in our heads of where we wanted to be.
You've obviously taken a very balanced and thoughtful approach to this. And I did read your article, the op-ed that came out in Morning Chalk Up a couple months ago on why my gym isn't an essential service. Did you get any blowback from that? Because it was quite counter a lot of the rhetoric that was going on social media.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely got some blowback. So for folks who didn't potentially read it, I wrote an op-ed for the Morning Chalk Up a few months ago, just about why my gym isn't an essential business. Because there was a lot of, like you said, people on social media claiming that their gyms were essential and that they should be allowed to be open and just sort of like defying regulations. And quite frankly, I was just pretty frustrated with it, where I was like, okay, if we all want to be open in, let's say, October 2020 with as few regulations as possible, the best thing we can probably do is get COVID as under control as we possibly can. And not listening and obeying regulations is like the worst way to potentially do that, right? That we need to think, I mean, sort of like training, right? Where you're like, I want to be good right now. Let me just do like the hardest, stupidest possible workout I can every single day until my body breaks down. It's like, well, okay, that's not a good idea. Like if you want to be good, like the best way to do it is to actually think about the long-term consequences of your actions. So that was kind of the sort of argument that I was making. I was like, listen, if you want your gym to be open and doing well and to not have, people afraid to come in and to not have regulations, like we need to get COVID under control. And very clearly a bunch of people getting together in indoor spaces, breathing on each other is like not necessarily the best way to get COVID under control. So like, let's think about this and try to figure out what actually works. And in terms of blowback, I mean, I expected there to be some controversy, but I didn't realize I was stepping on quite the cultural landmine that I was. Yeah, I mean, certainly some people pushed back. Most of them didn't really read the article clearly and just sort of like willfully misinterpreted things that I said. A few people actually, I think, had, thoughtful criticisms. And I had a conversation with John from Make WODs Great Again about that, where, he was essentially arguing about essentialness. And it was kind of an interesting discussion in that, I was referring more to essential business from like a regulatory perspective, where it's like, drugstores and grocery stores are essential businesses from a legal perspective in terms of them not being closed, not essential in terms of like net positive for society, let's say. Although the one pushback that was funny is that someone just signed me up for a bunch of like NRA and guns rights newsletters as sort of like a troll, where it's like, we're going to own this lib and like make him read a bunch of gun email, which, I mean, I'm actually impressed at how many different newsletters they signed me up for, because I keep unsubscribing and I'm like, how am I still on these lists? But, that was actually like a pretty good owning of a lib.
Good
so
to
to
get
speak.
a variety of opinions, right? You got to research what everyone's putting out and saying.
Do you still stand behind that, Todd? Like, do you still, because obviously some months have passed, and I can kind of see where people's frustrations with that article came from, because you have to look at it like, we're following regulations where the people that are setting the regulations don't even know what the fuck they're talking about half the time, right? So I can see it from both sides, where it's like, I think you took a common sense approach where you're like, it's probably not good to have 30 people in my gym sweating and breathing the same air. So I get that, but do you still feel exactly that same way? Or would you write that a little bit differently if you had to redo it today, knowing what you know over the past couple months?
Yeah, without having read that article since a few months ago, I don't actually know, since I don't remember exactly what I said. And I think that, you constantly are updating your beliefs and sort of making changes based upon, how things go and things like that. There definitely were some things I would have rephrased, because, I mean, like I said before, there were some people who I think were willfully misinterpreting what I said, but I think there are a few other things that just sort of struck the wrong tone, right? Like I was maybe a little bit pejorative in terms of talking about people being like contrarian conspiracy theorists and things like that, which like, I do think that there is a strain of that, particularly in the like, whatever, functional fitness, CrossFit, whatever community, which is sort of like, everyone is wrong and I know best. And, they tell me that Gatorade is good for me and whatever. So like, therefore my children shouldn't get vaccinated. And you're like, guys, come on, what planet are you on? So there's definitely a strain of that, but I didn't mean that to come across as, I guess, like insultingly as some people took that. So I would have definitely rephrased that. In terms of the overall thrust of things, I mean, I think we have a much better understanding of the way that COVID spreads currently than we did at that time, and very much so. It does seem that indoor spaces with a lot of like respiratory exchange are like essentially the way that, COVID spreads. So it's like, should gyms potentially be able to be open with people wearing masks and like not talking to each other a bunch before and after class? Like that seems like a pretty reasonable, like regulatory thing to impose upon gyms based upon, my understanding of the way that, we understand COVID to spread currently, right? And, I think the other aspect of it that I think you were starting to touch on, and we've experienced this as well, is that very clearly the folks making regulations don't necessarily have like a fine-grained understanding of how different types of fitness businesses work, right? Where it's like, okay, we're going to regulate gyms. What does that mean? Does that mean Planet Fitness? Does that mean Orange Theory? Does that mean a CrossFit gym? Does that mean an OPEX gym, right? Like all of those have a lot of different ability to sort of control what does and doesn't happen at their facilities. And certainly there is some, difficulty in that, because you're sort of left guessing at what they mean by regulations that are clearly not written for a facility of your size. And we've seen this in Chicago too, where there's a group of like boutique fitness owners who are sort of lobbying for, the regulators to actually understand the dynamics of our specific business model. And for the most part, I'm like on board with that. I'm like, we should definitely have a seat at the table to explain how this business works. But simultaneously, they're like, these class limits are ridiculous. Like we need to up the limit to 50 people and like we need to remove the mask requirement. I'm like, guys, I want a seat at the table, but like, that's stupid. Again, that's going to be the exact way that we continue to have this problem with COVID spreading in the community. And that's going to necessitate further regulations, fear in the consumer. Because I think that's another aspect that a lot of folks are missing is it's like, it's not just the state coming down on you. Like, people aren't going to come if they're scared. And if this is an ongoing problem, people are going to be scared. And whether or not you as a fitness business owner think that it is a big deal or not, like, people do. So it's not just like the state is stopping your business. It's like this entire problem actually is.
I think we're naturally biased toward feeling a certain type of way if it's advantageous for us, right? So it's like, that's just like what you're saying. If I own a CrossFit gym, I'm probably going to say I can make my CrossFit gym extremely safe. If I owned a personal training studio, I would probably say I'm so much different than this CrossFit gym. These are the things that I can do inside of my business that these guys can't do over there, right? So it's one of those things where it's like everyone, I don't care what people say, we're all naturally looking out for ourselves and our best interests, especially if we're considering the economics behind it. And I own a gym or a facility, and I'm thinking in the back of my head, like, I have to fucking make money, right? So it's like, how do I reverse engineer this thing to make my model the perfect model to combat COVID, or the perfect model to keep people as safe as possible, or whatever the case is? Because I've heard that argument from CrossFit gym owners. I've heard that argument from even our gym owners, right? And obviously we have that biasness as well toward our model. I've heard that argument from PT studios. I've even heard that argument from commercial gyms that have hundreds of people walking into a door and exercising, and like you said, the respiratory exchange, and there's 100x of that happening as compared to a personal training studio. So I think we're always going to find where our model can work best in this whole pandemic.
Todd, you'd mentioned that you guys are approaching capacity and kind of trying to figure out what to do next. Do you have any ideas around that? And is it feasible for you to keep operating with a limit of 10 people in the building?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting, and I'm not totally sure, right? Because with our model, again, we're kind of like mostly like a group class model with a decent amount of program design and personal training on top of that. The way we've sort of looked at things historically is almost like an airplane or an airline kind of business model, right? We're like, okay, if we can get the group classes to sort of cover operating costs, then everything we do on top of that is essentially profitable, right? And the way that a lot of airlines operate is that they don't really make money on tickets, but any of the additional upsells to drinks, to getting people to sign up for their miles, credit cards, et cetera, is where they actually make a lot of profit. And so we've kind of operated roughly in that paradigm of like, if we can have enough just straight up recurring monthly revenue from group class members to cover rent, payroll, utilities, et cetera, and then we're able to sell a decent amount of personal training and skill sessions and nutrition coaching and program design and stuff like that, then, we're able to have enough of a margin to be a reasonable business that can exist, right? And so with the current restrictions, it's difficult to say whether or not that's going to be the way things will work going forward. Certainly there is an element of like, okay, we're in a major downtown environment, and that changes things a lot, right? Because we have a lot of folks who are getting extended work from home orders that are not coming back to the gym anytime soon. Whereas I think that gyms that are located in more residential areas are potentially having less of that problem, right? Because their people are like, oh, I don't have to go into the office anymore. I'm going to join a gym by my house. So I think we're getting hit harder by that, but simultaneously, the ongoing like second and third order effects of that, we just sort of need to see where that settles out in terms of what is the potential population available to want to sign up for fitness services at a gym like ours. Based upon the simple supply and demand, based upon the simple supply and demand, aspects of like, okay, we have this many slots and this many people who want them, certainly there is an element of like, all right, the rates are just going to have to go up based upon that, which is a little bit uncomfortable, especially in times of like global pandemic, people losing jobs. You don't want to sort of just like price gouge your members. But I think that there is an element of like, okay, want to be accommodating of people for at least several months. Where we kind of start to see where this goes, but it is going to have to be like, all right, realistically, we did have, 275, 300 something members, depending on how you count it. And like now the new equilibrium is going to be 200. Like, well, okay, what is the cost per person to make that work? And I do think that there is also an element of being able to sell more stuff as kind of like a potential like whatever premium package, right? Where it's like, can we give off hours access to the facility? Can we give people sort of priority reservation now that they actually have to sign up for classes? Can we give people cubby storage now that we have to restrict the number of people that can kind of like be in one spot at once? If there's a lot of things like that you could potentially bundle together and say, hey, listen, if you want this quote unquote premium offering, it's an additional blank per month. And, that can sort of get that like revenue per member potentially up to something that does actually make sense. And it might not be the exact same model as before, but we're hoping that we're able to come up with something like that does get the, even if the total number of people paying monthly is down, that the sort of like monthly recurring revenue is at least close to what it was before.
Todd, are you guys still, is Legion, are you guys still rolling with the remote coaching business?
Yeah,
how's that going?
Yep, totally. Yeah, and that's actually, I expected that to be impacted by COVID as well, and it really hasn't been for us. I don't know what that's looked like for other people doing remote coaching, but I certainly expected just like the overall instability and potential lack of access to gyms, et cetera, to have people be like, I just can't really continue with remote coaching. But right now, I mean, we really retained like a really solid percentage of our clients throughout that, and people were just kind of like happy to do whatever overhead reverse dumbbell lunges and burpees in the corner in their homes.
How are you running? How are you running all this, man? So you're doing in South Loop, you have group, you have ID, you have personal training, and then you have an entirely separate business on the remote coaching side. Do you have partners? Do you just have a bunch of great coaches with you? How are you doing this?
Yeah, I mean, probably kind of like all of the above, right? I mean, in the gym, the brick and mortar gym, I have business partners there. They actually, at this point, I'm pretty much the only one who's like a full-time owner operator. One of my partners who moved to California still does a lot of like the back end stuff as far as finances, things like that. So that's super, super helpful. And we have several full-time coaches who are working at the gym, right? So the goal there has been to sort of like free me up to work on the overall like operations and systems of how the gym runs, which, I mean, I think there was a morning chalk up article about this recently, right? But a lot of just like tracking metrics, building systems, things like that, right? I mean, Carl, you had some stuff to say about that. So, a lot of my role at the gym isn't so much like on the floor coaching, whatever. Like I will do some of the onboarding process for new folks and try to dip my finger in the sales process periodically to, kind of facilitate that and make sure I know what's going on. But the reality is a lot of it is like, I mean, like a lot of jobs these days, it's like, oh, what is your job? Well, it's essentially to write software, like fiddle with systems that don't quite work right, and send email, right? So that's a lot of what I'm doing for the actual gym. And for the remote coaching, yeah, I mean, I have one of our coaches, John Colborn, who actually moved out to Denver and bought CrossFit Omnia out there. He and I are partners in Legion. And we have another coach, Luke Holmes, who works with us there. So, that's a lot of content creation, doing podcasts, writing articles, things like that, and essentially just designing programs for people. So, I'm able to kind of lean on a lot of folks to keep things moving in all those areas. I mean, I think the other aspect of it is just, I mean, I'm very regimented and bizarre with how I organize to-do lists and systems and things like that. And I just kind of like write it up and try to prioritize and just keep executing one thing after another. And it's sort of like a personality flaw or benefit, depending on how you look at it.
How many people are you coaching right now, Todd?
Yeah. With remote clients, you mean?
Yeah. Or let's just say remote plus individual design inside of your gym.
Yeah. So I have, I keep myself at 10 clients for that. For a while, I was much higher than that. I think that the peak clients I was working with was around 30 at some point. And then just as my responsibilities with, the content creation, the business systems, meetings, management, et cetera, as that starts to grow, you're like, God, I cannot handle writing another program right now, and like this person needs their training, and it just became somewhat miserable. And it's like, okay, what's a sustainable number for me? And 10 seems to be about right, where you can sort of maintain the fulfilling aspects of it and like actually work with people and not just be caught in this, dread of like, I have to get these programs out. They're not done. My brain is mush and I can't possibly conceive of writing another A1, A2. Like, I don't even know what you should do. I don't care. I don't care what you do. You just don't want to be in that spot.
You're just like run and do 100 dips and run and do 200 something.
Here's this cool workout that I found. Check it out.
On top of juggling all that you do, is fitness still like a big priority in your personal life?
Big priority is probably a little bit of a stretch. More like get training in and don't let it fall too far by the wayside, I think is, a more realistic way of looking at it, which is, certainly at various points, like training has been something that I've really enjoyed and like really, really prioritized. And I would say now it's more like, this is important and I can't let it slip too much, and, just sort of like force it in and recognize that even if, you don't want to do it and it's not exciting and your brain is like, just don't do your workout, like finish this broken thing on the website instead of doing the workout. You're like, no, you just have to go start it. And then once you start it, it's going to be fine. And you're going to be okay with it. So I think that's probably a more realistic way of looking at my own fitness.
It's always interesting just hearing coaches and business owners and, people that have been doing both of those things for such a long time to just hear how they battle their relationship with fitness, because it seems like with most people, Todd, it gets to a place like that where it's like, this thing used to be a massive priority for me, and that's why I got into this business, because I enjoyed to do this thing so much. And a lot of people think, and a lot of coaches / business owners think, I think this may have been more prevalent 5 years ago, but they're like, I want to go all in, I want to coach, and I want to own a gym because all I want to do is exercise and train all day long. And it's like, as soon as you take that leap and now you're a business owner, you're like, oh my God, I don't actually have time to do this. So it's always interesting to see how you navigate that battle, because we all love fitness, right? It's like, that's in all of our brains where we're like, how do I continue to do this? And not only do it, but fucking enjoy it, right? Because that's super important. Where are you going with that, man? Like, are you the type of guy that's like, you're good with your relationship with fitness, or are you still working on that?
I wanted to jump back on your point about like people wanting to open a gym because they're like, yeah, I just love coaching. I love working out. I've had that same conversation with many people where I'm like, listen, if you love coaching and you love working out, do not under any circumstances open a brick and mortar fitness business, especially in a major downtown environment. Because the last things you're going to ever want to do or be able to do are coach and work out. Like I said before, you're going to fucking write software and send emails and like deal with scheduling problems and management. Like that's what you're going to do. So be aware of that. But that said, I do think that there are plenty of people who are able to set up, their fitness business so that they can coach and work out. It just requires a lot of, being deliberate with it. And again, I think that that's a more realistic option for people, not in a major downtown environment where just like the overall rents and competition, and just like cost of doing business is so high that like the sort of like owner operator coach who's like, yeah, I have a few clients who I work with and I'm able to rent this space or whatever and sort of live the life I want. Like it's not realistic in downtown Chicago or New York or something like that. Whereas, if you travel 50 minutes outside the city and you can get a lease in a sort of like warehouse type of building out there, like you can probably make something like that work. So I too have had that conversation with folks. But to kind of circle back to your question just about fitness, I think that, I would like to have a little bit more, let's just say, bandwidth in my schedule so that it doesn't feel like there's such an opportunity cost to my own training, right? Because I think that's where it really starts to bother me is like, I know I should be doing this, but like I said before, for example, I recently rebuilt the website for the gym, right? That it was kind of like this hacked together monstrosity and it had all these problems with it. We were paying for all these services that didn't really do what we wanted them to. And it was like, okay, this thing just needs to be stripped down and rebuilt. And, you're like in the middle of something and you're getting this weird menu behavior and the form submission isn't working. And you're like, Do I really want to stop doing this and go do my training? Like, no. And it's probably more of a priority that like the website works properly, but like we just have to get it done. And so I think getting to the point where there's less of that like obvious opportunity cost to my time spent training, I think would be helpful for me. But I'm really okay with it just being this sort of like like an ancillary maintenance activity. It's not something where I'm like, yeah, I just really want to devote hours and hours and hours to training again. Like that's not really anything that I'm super interested in.
You set yourself up for failure, man, opening up in downtown Chicago, that's for sure.
It's not, I think that a boutique fitness business in a downtown area in a major urban environment is like really just not the best idea. There's a lot of factors going against you.
Have you ever thought about moving your facility to like the suburbs?
No, not really. I mean, I think that, again, like from a business model perspective, that would certainly be a lot easier. I think for us, we're fortunate in that, through years of perseverance and some lucky breaks along the way, we're sort of like the leader in the market in downtown Chicago. So it's like, okay, we've established a pretty good position. And then even with a pretty good position, it's like, this is still a very difficult business model, which I think you see again in a lot of adjacent industries like restaurants or whatever, where it's like you have this restaurant in a major urban environment downtown, and it seems like there's a lot of people there all the time. And then you look at the actual margins on the business and you're like, wow, how does that actually work? We're a little bit better off than some of those restaurant businesses, but I think that we've done well enough that it's like, okay, we've sort of like won a lot of the hard battles, and now it's a matter of just being able to tweak a lot of little stuff that still kind of like needs to be adjusted, and then hopefully you see where we come out on the other side of the current uncertainty with COVID. But I think that we've built something that at least kind of makes sense given all the difficulties.
Yeah, down the road, man, in Kenosha, down the road from you, I mean that place is burning down right now, man.
Yeah,
and that's my hometown. And what?
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, I was born in Chicago, but I grew up in Kenosha.
Yeah.
What?
Why don't you call it Kenosha?
Because I'm not from there, man. What are you guys? What are your thoughts on that, man? Like I know like the George Floyd stuff in Chicago that hit really heavy, protest wise, and I have a lot of family in Chicago still. So just kind of hearing the stories of what happened and what's still happening there, and then this happening this past weekend, and there's a lot of Chicago connections with Kenosha. A lot of people from Kenosha are from Chicago and vice versa. So what are you seeing right now, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, it's to your point, right? There's just a lot of like general unrest in a lot of urban environments, right? That there were certainly very large protests in Chicago, post the George Floyd situation, and that there was a lot of like widespread looting and stuff like that as well. I mean, down the street from our gym, they were looting the Target, that a lot of nearby businesses had stuff thrown through their windows. Someone actually kicked our door really, really hard and kind of broke our lock a little bit, but it was like basically fine. So we came out reasonably unscathed from that. And then actually recently, this was maybe a few weeks ago, there was a police shooting on the south side of Chicago, and then actually a bunch of misinformation associated with that shooting, which I think this is the more like kind of like dangerous and difficult aspect of these political situations, right? Is that police ended up shooting someone who was like an armed person committing a crime who was brandishing a gun at the police, right? Which like, independent of like a lot of like broader systemic issues, et cetera, it's like, okay, if police are going to be shooting at someone who's committing a crime and pointing a gun at them, like you can kind of see how that happens. But what ended up happening is that there was misinformation spread on social media that police had shot and killed an unarmed 15-year-old, right? Which just wasn't the case. And then there was another round of like looting all night based upon that, right? And our coach actually came in at 6 a.m. and opened up the gym and messaged me and was like, hey, there's like people looting right outside the gym right now. I don't necessarily feel safe here. And they closed down downtown Chicago again based upon that. And so we ended up closing the gym for the day, where I was like, yo, if you don't feel safe, like just, shut it down. Email everyone who signed up to come in. tell them that, access is cut off and that it's not potentially safe, et cetera. And so I think that one of the challenges with stuff like this is that we're seeing a lot of folks getting these extended work from home orders. We're seeing this potential for significant social unrest and potential violence, even if there's not necessarily like a root cause that actually makes a lot of sense. And that's something I think is concerning to a lot of people, right? Where it's like, if there's this type of reaction every single time that there's a negative interaction between an individual and police in a country of however many million people, like, what's going to actually happen down the road? And so, I don't necessarily see that as being something that's going to be continuing to escalate like that. I think that there's a lot of tension and a lot of justifiable anger right now. And I do think at some point that some of at a policy level, that a lot of stuff is going to have to change in terms of how, we handle policing in this country, how we handle, the sort of like entrenched interests of police unions and the way that officers are protected in legal ways that kind of don't make a lot of sense, like qualified immunity. Like, there's a lot of stuff like that I do think is going to have to change, and there's going to have to be more of a cost on actual police departments if and when there is some sort of, unjustified violent incident, and that hopefully some of that is able to change the political dynamics that do result in this kind of just like, whoa, okay, people are reacting very strongly to a sense of injustice that, whether or not the exact details of everything that is being reacted to is correct, it's like there is a reason for it, and I do think that politically we are going to have to do something about that.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with the tension comment, man, because, and I didn't realize this until, actually leaving the Midwest 15 years ago, but there's a lot of tension in the Midwest because a lot of people look at Chicago, Midwest, and, Minneapolis, Milwaukee as like, it's the Midwest. It's not the South. There's not like a massive amount of racism everywhere and all that. And getting out of that environment and just living other places around the country and around the world, I look back at the Midwest and I'm like, man, because I have a lot of family from the South as well. And I'm like, gosh, the Midwest mirrors the South in a lot of ways with just a lot of racism and, a lot of issues with the police. And that in Chicago, man, it's massive there, and even worse as you go a little bit north to Milwaukee and Kenosha. But yeah, I think there's just so much tension there that it's just, you don't really realize it until you get out of it and you live somewhere else for an amount of time and you're like, wow, I didn't realize it was that bad there. So just, and I'm not saying anything is justified or not in actions that are happening right now, but you have to, when you take a step back, you get it, right? You understand it just because there's so much tension that's built over the past, few decades, right? So yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what pocket we're in and, who we associate with. And, I have a lot of, cop friends and, someone next to me may not have a lot of cop friends, and you know what I'm saying? So I think it just depends on what circle you run with, and that kind of molds the way that you think about all of this stuff. But man, I think, I do think we were kind of calming a little bit, but just seeing that this past weekend, it was just that feeling of like, here we go again, right? Because I've, my brothers and sisters live blocks away from where that happened. And I just look at Facebook, right? And I just look at like friends from high school posting pictures of Kenosha, and you're like, what? The city's actually completely burned down. And it's still going. Like right now, there's live feeds of buildings burning down. So the entire downtown is literally gone. Like it's literally burned down. So you look at that and you're just like, this is like Mad Max type shit. Like this stuff is actually happening right now, and it's not going to stop in the foreseeable future in that little pocket. And I think that's going to continue to go to Chicago, and Chicago is going to come down there, and it's going to go to Minnesota again. And I think I think it's just it's good to have conversations about it just to get perspectives, especially yours, because you're right there right now. But yeah, I think we're at the beginning of this thing again.
Yeah, and to your point just about the Midwest, it's not like the South, and there may be some truth to that in terms of like the legacy of, let's say quote unquote institutionalized racism is a little bit different in the North, right? That in the South you had like very clear on the books laws that were like, you shall not come here. Whereas in Chicago, it's like, well, why don't we just build these expressways and public transportation in an exact way to isolate, Black communities from the rest of the city, right? So it's a much more, it may have the same effect, but it's more like pernicious. And to your point, like, breeds like an extreme lack of trust, right? Because it's like you said that, this was the North and this, that, whatever. But actually, if you go back and look at how the Daley family set up certain things or, moved University of Illinois at Chicago from its original location, like specifically to block downtown from Black neighborhoods and things like that, you're like, okay, there's a lot of stuff that happened here that essentially it has created a powder keg that's ready to blow based upon a lot of, like I said, justified anger. And again, the exact mechanics of how those things are manifesting themselves today. Again, it may be something that maybe doesn't make sense to someone who doesn't know all those details or isn't aware of some of the ways that certain communities have been like very specifically and purposefully targeted by larger institutions. But that it's I don't know what the solution is, but it's definitely something that you're like, yeah, this is something that probably could have been prevented with a lot of changes, but there weren't necessarily good incentives to make those changes at the time. That it's always easier to appease the constituencies that want, okay, well, we want to protect our neighborhoods, we want to protect our businesses, we're afraid of these kinds of people, et cetera. And it's like,
What do you think, Georgia? What are your thoughts on the whole?
No, it's sometimes hard for me to weigh in on just not having grown up here and experienced life in America as a child. Like I moved here when I was 22, so I do have a different perspective on it in that regard. But prior to moving to Arizona, we're very sheltered here. I think it's fair to say we live in a bit of a bubble in Scottsdale. But I lived in Detroit for 5 years, which I think has a lot of there's a similar dynamic to what's going on in Chicago, just in terms of how the city is set up and historically white flight from the city and how that's left people very much separated. And yeah, it's like I said, tough to weigh in. Just not having the context, but I've certainly seen that play out living in the Midwest and living in Detroit.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, Todd. I think we'll wrap it up there, man. On that note.
Great.
It's kind of hard to follow that one up.
Yeah, very uplifting.
Yeah, man.
Good conversations to have, though.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for coming on, bud. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks,
totally.
Todd.
Stay with us for more Backroom Talk.
Yeah, that was my first time really sitting down and chatting with Todd, but I know you guys have a history. Mm-hmm. How has OPEX and Todd been connected in the past?
Yeah, Todd's an OPEX OG, right? Like he explained how we got into fitness in our conversation, and it was around that time that he also got into OPT. Just because, he's one of the most interesting people I've ever met in my entire life, right? So you can kind of imagine him imagine him sitting in a CrossFit Level 1 seminar. He's the type of guy that's going to be thinking the wheels are going to be turning, and he's gonna ask himself, this can't be it, right? So he went and searched for those answers, and that's how we found James in OPT. He's from Chicago, so from my hometown, and he owns South Loop Strength Conditioning, which is they just have such a great reputation in Chicago and in the Midwest. So yeah, I mean, Todd's been doing this for a really, really long time, and he's done a lot of things in his life, right? I know I said he's a really interesting guy, but you talk to him and you're like, usually when you're talking to a coach / gym owner, they're just like fitness all the way. This guy's like, yeah, I traveled and I was in a band, and I'm thinking like they put their pennies together and were like traveling around the country, but this guy was like Warped Tour traveling around the world in a legit band, and he's an unbelievably good musician. And just his academic background and how well spoken he is, he's just an impressive guy.
Yeah, he's incredibly thoughtful, and you can see that with every question that we asked him, there's always a calculated response. Yep. And he's thinking about both sides and weighing it up. But gosh, there's so much value. Like if you're someone who's working with people, as a coach does, I think in having that perspective and having those life experiences and not thinking that fitness is like the be all and end all, but knowing that there's things outside of that, like Todd obviously does. I think that
that's a huge value add for a coach.
Yeah, it was also great to get his insight and to just, how he thought about, the COVID situation and how he handled that in downtown Chicago, which was just an absolute mess. It still is, to be honest, but it was an absolute mess, March, April, May. And then just to get his opinions on what's going on, in Kenosha, which is bleeding up into Chicago right now with the shootings and the rioting and, the killing on the morning that we actually talked to him.
Yeah.
So, it was good to get his perspective, and he has a good one, right? Like, I asked that question, and I was 50-50. I was like, he may just be like, breeze over it or something, but we had a 15-minute conversation on that, and he talked about, Chicago and the history of Chicago and the Midwest versus the South. So it was really good to get his perspective on those things.
Yeah, I completely agree. One thing I found interesting as well is just the way the gym is operating right now, and he was upfront and honest that with the way things are and the ability to only have 10 people in and uncertainty around people wanting to return to the gym, like, he doesn't know how long they can continue operating like that. Now I trust that, again, he's going to figure a way to pivot and make it work, but yeah, that's a reality that a lot of gym owners and coaches are struggling with right now.
Yep.